I know some of you are here because of the topics that you're studying, but some of you also may have interest in careers in foreign policy and diplomacy. For those who are interested, we have a student group called the Foreign Service Student Organization that's existed since 1999. They sponsor regular events relating to careers in the Foreign Service, and there are flyers, I think, that have been passed out. If you're interested in learning more about the Foreign Service exam and the process and the steps you can take, please come back at 3 o'clock today, perfectly timed. Jordan Tanner, who's a retired Foreign Service officer, formerly with the U.S. Information Agency, also a former Utah legislator, kindly volunteers his time to meet with students each fall. And so this is a once-a-year opportunity today at 3 o'clock, and it will go until 5. So all your questions can be answered, and you can plan your diplomatic career out at 3 o'clock back here in this room. Well, Rose Eilene Gottemoeller was appointed Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security in March, where she advises the Secretary on arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament. She's served as acting in this position since February 2012 and was also serving as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance, a position she was appointed to in April 2009. She was Chief U.S. Negotiator at the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the Russian Federation, which entered into force in February 2011. In 2000, prior to the Department of State, she was a Senior Associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, also serving as Director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, as Deputy Undersecretary of Energy for Defense, Nuclear Nonproliferation, and Assistant Secretary and Director for Nonproliferation and National Security. Previously, she served for 3 years as Deputy Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, on the National Security Council staff as Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasian Affairs, and she was a social scientist at RAND and a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. She has taught on Soviet military policy and Russian security at Georgetown University. She received her BS from Georgetown University and an MA from George Washington University and is fluent in Russian. The topic for today's discussion, nuclear policy for the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Undersecretary Gottemoeller.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Thank you for the blessing on our discussions this morning. It's a good and inspiring way to start any discussion. It doesn't happen very often in Washington, so I appreciate it very, very much. Before I turn to my topic, I did want to add an extra little advertisement for our State Department internship program. If you are interested, it is also something to look into in addition to the Foreign Service, which can provide you an entire career working in the world of diplomacy. But we have had quite a few interns from BYU come to the State Department in recent years. You do have to start early, so if you want to come next summer, for example, now is the time to be thinking about it. But on the State Department, state.gov website, you'll find information about our internship program, and we love to have students come from BYU because you have excellent international relations, political science here, and you're really savvy and know the score. So please do consider an internship at the State Department also. Now, I'm going to dive into talking about my favorite topic, near and dear to my heart, which is nuclear weapons disarmament. And I wanted to focus, we don't have a whole lot of time. I know there's another lecture starting at 12. So for about 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about the kind of evolution from the New START Treaty that I worked on and took through ratification in the Senate to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and what we are working on now in terms of our ratification goal. Lay out what we would like to accomplish in that regard, and then throw the floor open for your questions. So anything you're interested in, I'll try to do my best to answer. I really am the gal at the State Department who works on weapons of mass destruction matters, so I can range a little farther afield from that, but I'll let you know if I really don't have the information at the tip of my fingers. But let me just start with the New START Treaty. I did work on negotiating this treaty between the beginning stages of the Obama administration. We started in April 2009, and in April 2010, the president signed this treaty with then Russian President Medvedev. It is bringing the level of U.S. nuclear forces and Russian nuclear forces down to the lowest level of deployed warheads since the late 1950s. So when New START is fully implemented in 2018, we will have 1,550 deployed warheads. The Russians will have the same. 700 delivery vehicles, that includes ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launched missiles, and bomber warheads included in that number of 700 delivery vehicles. And it's a very serious treaty in that it does two things. The Russians, in the course of the 1990s, they were suffering from a severe economic crisis, and their nuclear arsenal was in severe crisis. Now they've got the bit between their teeth, as you can see across the spectrum of political issues. They are, throwing their weight around in Ukraine, which has caused a grave international crisis and for which we have sanctioned them since very severely on the economic front. But in terms of the modernization of their nuclear forces, they are now building up those capabilities. So we want to make sure that they are capped at 700 and do not move beyond that level to go to higher levels of capability and to bring the warhead levels higher as well. We want to continue to bring numbers down, and that is a very important goal for this treaty. Making that case to the U.S. Senate, as you can imagine, was not an easy thing to do in this era when bipartisanship is not particularly popular or operative in Washington, and there were lots of stresses and strains in terms of the relationship between the White House and the Senate. But I have to say that by very, very careful work and by really talking to the senators in detail about what the treaty was about, what it meant in terms of getting our inspectors on the ground inside Russian nuclear weapons facilities and their bases to see what kinds of deployments they were carrying out, to see how they were fulfilling their commitments under the treaty. All of these were very important arguments, and the senators listened very hard. So in the end, we did have a bipartisan vote in support of the New START treaty, and the treaty entered into force in February of 2011. I'm glad to tell you that even in this era of real bilateral crisis, I said Ukraine was a multilateral crisis, an international crisis, and it is, but also it's caused a lot of tension between Moscow and Washington, and for very good reason. We don't in any way condone what the Russians have been doing on the international stage, and in the specific case of Ukraine. But in this case, they have continued to fulfill their responsibilities under New START. They're allowing our inspectors to come in to their bases 18 times a year. Practically every day they send us a notification about what's happening with the movements of their strategic forces. So if one of their bombers has to go from its home base to a maintenance facility, they have to send us a notification of that. So 24/7, we know what's going on in their strategic nuclear arsenal thanks to the notification and data exchange regimes of the New START treaty. So it's been very good for U.S. national security overall, and they've been living up to it. I'm happy to say it's been implemented in a very business-like manner. So that has given me some cause to believe that in other areas as well, we can make the case to the Senate that ratification of an arms control treaty does benefit U.S. national security and will continue to benefit U.S. national security, come what may with the ups and downs of the international conflict and crisis cycle. And that's what treaties of this kind are all about. They are to provide for predictability. That I always put at the head of the list. Predictability, mutual predictability, and mutual stability, that neither side can undertake a sudden movement in their strategic nuclear forces that would destabilize, and ultimately international security, not only for us, not only for the Russians, but for the entire international community. So I think those arguments are very potent ones. And now I would like to turn those arguments to ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty's been before the Senate since the late 1990s. The Senate in 1999 failed to give its advice and consent to this total ban on explosive nuclear testing. They failed to give their advice and consent for two reasons. They said, first of all, you guys just negotiated this thing a couple years ago. We don't know if it's going to be verifiable. You've said you're going to build up an international system for monitoring this treaty. We don't know if it's going to work. So that was one reason the senators gave in that time for voting against the treaty. The second reason had to do with the science-based stockpile stewardship program. We said to the Senate at that time, and that was really the underpinnings for us being able to negotiate this comprehensive ban on nuclear testing, was to say, we don't need to test nuclear weapons. We can, through a process of monitoring the stockpile, using various diagnostic techniques, using supercomputers to do calculations of the capabilities of the nuclear arsenal, we can keep track of what's going on with our nuclear weapons, and we can ensure that they are safe, secure, and effective going forward. But in 1999, the senators said, we don't know if this thing is going to work. And more seriously, the laboratory directors, the national laboratory directors said, we're not sure this is going to work. Maybe we need nuclear explosive testing going forward. And so over the ensuing 15 years, what has happened is that the capabilities of the science-based stockpile stewardship program have been built up, and the facilities have been built. The capabilities for doing large-scale supercomputing have been built up, and now our national laboratory directors are saying this is a good capability. In fact, we believe today that we know more about the behavior of our warheads through science-based stockpile stewardship than we knew during the era of explosive nuclear testing. So those two arguments, I think, against the treaty in 1999 have now moved 180 degrees in the other direction, and I think there are very good reasons for moving forward with this treaty. Why? Why is the treaty good for U.S. national security? Let me give you two reasons, and then I'm going to wrap up and we can turn to our discussion. First of all, we are looking at a number of states around the world who are interested in building nuclear bombs. Some of them have never built a bomb before. Those are states that we worry about them proliferating. In the Middle East, for example, if Iran moves forward with developing a nuclear capability, we've got a good negotiation going on now. We're hoping to shut that down. But nevertheless, if Iran moves forward, then the fear is that other states around the Middle East, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, will themselves want to develop nuclear weapons. Well, a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty would place a significant barrier in the way, I call it a speed bump, in the way to them developing a primitive nuclear weapon. One can develop a primitive nuclear weapon without testing, but they're never going to be confident that the thing actually works if they can't test it. So that's one significant barrier that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty places in the way of new entrants to the nuclear club, and it is an important barrier. For those states around the world who already have nuclear weapons, and there are not that many, there are 9 states, but nevertheless some of the ones who are now acquiring nuclear weapons like Pakistan and India, this places also significant speed bumps in their way. They have some basic capability, but if they wanted to develop more advanced nuclear weapons, boosted nuclear weapons, hydrogen weapons, they would have to test in order to be sure that these weapons were capable. And so again, it places speed bumps in the way of the modernization of more simple nuclear arsenals around the world. So it's important from that perspective, and at the height, I would say, or the core of this argument is the notion that it will place a speed bump in the way of an arms race in Asia, where the states are modernizing and developing their nuclear capabilities, China, India, and Pakistan. So the focus here is on developing a ban, putting it in place, and ensuring that it will be in place going forward with a legally binding monitoring and verification regime. By the way, we have actually had a moratorium in place on nuclear testing since 1992. President Bush put in place a moratorium on nuclear testing, and that moratorium has held firm now for 22 years, with a few exceptions. In 1998, India and Pakistan tested. We came down on them like a ton of bricks with sanctions, and really, push them back away from that testing program that they both had begun. And so both of them are now abiding by the nuclear test moratorium. The only country who has tested in this century is North Korea. And that is, I think, a very interesting commentary on nuclear testing. It's not something that states that are in good stead with the international community are ready to do. So I say, why not put in place a comprehensive test ban treaty with a legally binding monitoring and verification regime so we can keep track of what is going on around the world? Why not have that in place? Because for 22 years, we have not tested, and we are not planning to test again. Now, finally, I think an important argument about, and it's very important here in Utah, and that is we need to, I think, ensure that nuclear weapons testing is off the table forever because of the human impacts of nuclear testing. And nowhere is that felt, I think, more acutely than in those states of the United States that were downwind of the Nevada nuclear test site. I began my trip here to Utah 2 days ago down in St. George. I went to visit Dixie State University as well, had an evening lecture where many people from the town came as well, and I had an opportunity to talk to them about their family experience with the downwind effects of nuclear testing from the 1950s on, and heartrending stories. I know some of you, your families have also experienced the same. So I think that there is a good reason from the perspective of the human impacts and consequences of nuclear testing to put in place a ban that will preclude it from occurring forever. And so that is why we are very, I think, interested. It's a second reason that I find very compelling and worth looking at for moving forward with ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So I am in Utah over the next, few hours. I'm heading back to the East Coast later on today. But the whole idea is to talk to the public, talk to student groups like this one, begin to develop a public discourse on this matter because of the fact that it's been now 15 years since this treaty was before the Senate. In 1999, 85% of the American public supported the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but the American public today doesn't know anything about it. And when I talk to groups of students, when I talk to people from the public, they don't know anything about it. So I think it's really important to start now this discourse and debate to raise the level of interest in the treaty among the American public. And then they can begin to talk to their senators back in Washington about the importance of the treaty and the importance of moving forward with ratification of the treaty. So it's an important goal overall. Why do I think it's possible in this day of, a lot of fisticuffs in Washington, a lot of lack of bipartisan support for any number of worthy initiatives? I think it's possible because I have the experience of ratifying New START, which happened in 2010. And I think that the senators were very responsible about their responsibility to give advice and consent to the treaty and very interested in its national security benefits. So I think that we can do the same with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So with that, let me throw the floor open to your questions, your comments. As I said, I'll try to range more widely. If you like, I did end up doing a lot of work on the Syria chemical weapons problem this year. I know you've probably been very much watching what's going on in Ukraine. Happy to talk about that to the extent I can. But please, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Those of you who have been over here know kind of the routine. We have a queue up at the microphone, and please tell us your name and what you're studying.
I'm studying life. I'm Christopher Lund. I coordinate the Latin American studies. So I'm more of a humanist than a
nuke type.
A nuclearist.
Yeah.
And I like your analogy of the speed bump. To pursue that, my experience with speed bumps is that sometimes you don't see them and there are always scars where the transmissions have
Yeah.
counted.
Right.
Some speed bumps are delightfully painted yellow, painted red. So my question is, if there's a rogue state like North Korea who may or may not care about a speed bump, what are the truly, now you said like a ton of bricks. I want to know articulately what the teeth are in the ban, in the treaty.
I think the teeth are, as I put it, both the multilateral teeth that are associated with the regime and its monitoring and verification, and our own national teeth to be able to detect and see what is going on. So we already pay a lot of attention to North Korea. When we get warning that a nuclear test may be in the offing, we send our monitoring and sensor systems to be close by, our own national capabilities to monitor what is happening. When a test occurs, you get seismic signals, of course, you get radioactivity, and sometimes those gases become available for sensors, very sensitive sensors to detect. So we've got our own national teeth, and I should have said that as part of what I'm talking about. The improvements that have taken place in the monitoring system are on the international front, but they are also in our own national capability. So we will certainly be capable of working on the detection problem, but now we have the international community as well ready to join in the detection analysis and effort. And furthermore, we'll have the opportunity for an on-site inspection. And in fact, I'm going to Jordan in a couple weeks for an on-site inspection exercise where they will be trying out the technologies and the procedures for on-site inspection under the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So an international team will be able to go in and go to the test site in a country we suspect of conducting an illicit nuclear test. If they say no, then that, of course, is a major trigger and a major signal that they are cheating on the treaty. But also if they go, yes, please come on in, and then we go to the site and find evidence of an illicit nuclear test, then we can essentially call them out in violation of the treaty. And there we have a range of tools that are available to us, including taking it to the United Nations Security Council for sanctions activity. North Korea is already under a host of sanctions, but if they get to the point of being ready to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, I'm assuming at that point they will also proceed it as they have promised to denuclearize the North Korean peninsula, so in which case the sanctions regime would have been loosened on North Korea, but we would be again clamping down on them with very severe economic sanctions. The teeth in these treaties has a lot to do, of course, with respect for the international system and the international system of law. And therefore, it is important to bear in mind that there is an element of international condemnation that comes to bear as well. You're quite right, a country like North Korea, in some way, if we're thinking about Pyongyang as it currently exists in the international system, I'm sure they would brush it aside. But we are talking about a much different time in which North Korea has decided that it wants to join the international community again. And so it will, I assume, care if the benefits of being in communion with the international system are again jerked away from it. So it's, you got to think about it as being a different time too as well. Please.
My name is Mihai. I'm studying international relations. Nuclear weapons serve as a deterrent to invasion. And given the, for instance, the situation in Ukraine, are there any viable alternatives to this kind of deterrence for countries that fear invasion? For instance, Kiev right now, does it regret having given up its stock of nuclear weapons when it did?
Very good question, actually, and it's one I have grappled with personally because I was responsible among a team of people with the negotiation of the Budapest Memorandum back in 1993 and 1994. And I do consider it a signal accomplishment that we were able to ensure that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that nuclear weapons did not remain in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. We would have had an expansion by a wide margin of the number of states with significant nuclear capabilities. But would they really have been nuclear capabilities? My question always was, and the argument I made back in that period to the Ukrainians was, it would have been very difficult for them to establish control over those weapons, and they would have been an element of destabilization in the post-Soviet settlement across Eurasia, and in fact would have resulted, I think, in major conflict with Russia much earlier. If they somehow had nuclear weapons today, I do not again think they would have been element of a stable deterrence force, but in actuality would have been a source of greater tension in the crisis as Russia would have come in and tried to take over, I think, those capabilities. So, but that's a subject of great argument. To your larger question of what is available for deterrence, in actual fact, across the world, the greatest capabilities that are available for deterrence are conventional and not nuclear. In most conflicts around the world, nuclear weapons are simply irrelevant because it is the conventional capabilities and the promise of extended deterrence among allied relationships that, in fact, provide the greatest surety to any country that they are safe from attack. We say when we go out and talk to our allies in Europe or in Asia and Japan and South Korea, we say to them, extended deterrence is not solely, by any means, made up of nuclear weapons. Extended deterrence requires very capable conventional forces. It requires good missile defenses. It requires very capable command and control, including space-based assets. We need to have a wide-ranging and capable conventional force. Nuclear weapons are simply not usable. Therefore, they have very limited utility in any real conflict that occurs. I've been saying recently that nuclear deterrence is so stable at the moment. In the case of Moscow, they have made the decision that any number of mischievous acts can be perpetrated under a nuclear umbrella. So I do not think, frankly, their calculus would have been changed, really, and in fact it might have been changed to greater mischief in terms of how they would have treated the Ukrainians. So, but it's a very interesting question. I think it makes sense to reflect on the wide range and spectrum of capabilities that make up a deterrent force, and it's not only nuclear weapons, but capable conventional capabilities, defense, and command and control as well. Please.
My name is Logan. I'm studying international relations and Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking in our class about non-provocative defense, where states don't have the ability to first strike or have offensive weapons, but only defensive capabilities as a way of deterring threats, because if everyone is not aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
Is there talk of this in Washington in pursuing a non-provocative approach, or does the Washington debate focus on maintaining first strike capabilities? Or what is the debate in Washington?
Could I throw a question back at you? What do you mean by defensive capabilities? Actually, it's been a very active debate in Washington over the provision of assistance, security assistance to Ukraine. And the question in that context is, what is a defensive capability? Okay, some things you can say are clearly defensive, like a missile defense system, for example, that cannot shoot offensively against a target, but is only for intercepting incoming offensive weapons. But if you provide a UAV to Ukraine to oversee the peace deal we hope will unfold between Russia and Ukraine, yes, it definitely could be used to oversee the eastern part of Ukraine and ensure there are no more Russian incursions. But the Russians are saying now, and they've been saying to the Germans and the French, who are looking to provide UAVs to the Ukrainians for the use in the East, they say, well, how do we know you're not going to use them for targeting? So I'm interested in your class. How do you talk about this?
Yeah, we haven't talked much about the specifics of what types of arms are considered offensive or defensive, but more the theory of the U.S. force posturing. Is the debate or the direction in Washington towards a primacy or aggressive stance, and that being their deterrent philosophy, or a defensive philosophy where nuclear weapons are reducted far below even other countries and not necessarily the primary factor.
If you're talking about nuclear weapons per se, then I would say that our position is very clearly articulated by President Obama, that we need to be pressing internationally for a steady pace toward nuclear disarmament, step by step, but in that step-by-step process, not allowing our own security to be disadvantaged. And so for that reason, we do not argue against moving far below parity, for example, with the Russian Federation. So I think that that is a prudent decision, but nevertheless, we're pressing the Russians to continue to move to lower and lower numbers below the levels of New START. So that's on the nuclear side. On the conventional side, if you're talking about our very capable conventional forces, the United States does not posture itself as the aggressor in any case, but it does posture itself as the defender. And particularly in these situations where we are looking to defend our allies, that's an important calculus. In the Middle East today, thinking about the threat that ISIL poses, it's been gripping Washington very, very much, and concerning the president on down about what to do to remove this threat to the Middle East as a whole and to the whole international community. So we do have, and I'm sure in your classes you've been talking about the reputation of the U.S. as the world's policeman, and some people struggle against that. But on the other hand, I think there is a degree of appreciation that we are willing to play that role. So many questions here. I'm kind of giving you other things to think about, but I don't have a firm answer myself to your question. But I would say that the United States does not seek to posture itself as the aggressor in any situation. Thank you. Please.
My name is Caleb Ellis, and I'm studying political science here. Thomas Schelling has argued that there's a nuclear taboo throughout the world. Have you seen evidence of this taboo, and if so, how has it affected your efforts to control nuclear arms?
I actually see a lot of evidence of Schelling's nuclear taboo in the way when President Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that dealt a severe shock to the world community, and people really began to say that this is a true existential threat to mankind, not only to the two countries who would perpetrate a nuclear exchange, in that case the United States and the Soviet Union, but to the entire world community. And therefore, we have to look for ways to ensure nuclear nonproliferation. And that sharp shock in the early 1960s led to the Nonproliferation Treaty in the late 1960s, and we are still very much working under the umbrella of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. President Kennedy said back at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis that we could end up with dozens of nuclear states and a very, very unstable international situation with the potential for nuclear conflagration at every turn. And so he urged the negotiation of the Nonproliferation Treaty. And by the way, the Russians joined. We had never had the experience of negotiating a big arms control treaty with the Russians in the late 60s, but they joined in with a will to put in place the Nonproliferation Treaty because they too were really, I think, they were hit over the head by the implications of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so they joined in too with putting that in place. Today, as we said, we have 9 nuclear states in the world, 9 states with nuclear weapons. There are 5 states under the Nonproliferation Treaty: UK, France, Russia, China, and the United States. There is, in addition, then the South Asian states, Pakistan, India, and our bad boy, North Korea. So there are states that we are, very, very concerned about in this regard. And Iran, we are very concerned about acquiring nuclear weapons capability as well. But in the end of the day, President Kennedy's nightmare of dozens of nuclear weapon states around the world has not become reality. And I think it's largely because states have, really pulled back from the idea that nuclear weapons are a benefit to their security. And I think that very much responds to Thomas Schelling's hypothesis in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Joseph Smith. I'm also international relations. I have a question more directed towards the U.S.-Russia issue that currently they are dismantling both some of their weapons. Somewhere sitting right now in the neighborhood of like 1,000 ready to deploy. But both states have actively been phasing out the old equipment, phasing in new, more advanced warheads, methods of delivery, et cetera. So with regards to the ban on testing, is kind of the hope that the nations know enough, just kind of cross their fingers and hope that the new equipment is going to work? Where is the direction kind of heading for that? Is it just scientifically building delivery systems, or kind of, can you help me out there?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you brought up that contrast between the delivery systems per se and the nuclear warheads. It's the nuclear warheads we believe can be maintained through the Science-Based Stockpile Stewardship Program, through the small-scale it's testing of various components, but not doing a nuclear explosive test, and doing large-scale analysis through our supercomputers, that type of thing. So here, our lab directors are confident we can maintain the warheads without explosive testing. Over on the delivery vehicle side, if we're talking about missile development, if we're talking about a new bomber, which is much being debated in Washington, all of these are very expensive items, new submarines, we do test missiles as we develop them, and they are very carefully tested to ensure that they perform, their propulsion system performs, that they are accurate, and that they don't break up in flight, so that their materials are capable of the kinds of paces that they are put through. So very good question. I'm glad you asked it, because I think that juxtaposition between delivery vehicles and nuclear weapons, the bombs themselves, definitely needs to be kept in mind.
Thank you.
Thanks.
My name is Nick Boyer. I'm studying international relations, and my question is directed more towards East Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been wondering, you mentioned the potential for an arms race in East Asia, and thankfully, historically, nuclear arms races haven't actually resulted in nuclear war yet.
Mm-hmm.
Should there be a nuclear arms race in East Asia, how do you feel that would affect?
There is a nuclear arms race in East Asia.
Should that develop more on the international stage? Do you feel that that would affect the potential for a nuclear war?
Yeah. Also a very good question. And getting back, I see some of you have been studying shelling, and no doubt the other, I would say, big brains of the beginning of the nuclear age in the 1950s, when game theory was first being developed, and this notion of mutual assured destruction and the relationship between states in a nuclear relationship was being laid down. And it really, the theories held firm for a two-player game, for the Soviet Union and the United States as the two big actors. The complex situation, and the reason I worry about South Asia so much, and Asia as a whole, is because it is a multiple-player game now. We have India and Pakistan, of course, ranged against each other with some very, very, I would say, and we've seen them, sharp opportunities for crisis. We go through waves of crisis between those two countries, but we are, as a matter of our national policy, constantly urging them to get back to the table, to build mutual confidence, to work on issues of strategic stability between the two of them. But one of the more complicating factors there is that India says, well, hey, wait a minute, we don't only have Pakistan to be worried about, we're worried about China. And indeed, in terms of developing their delivery vehicles, we can see as they develop longer range systems, they are targeting against China, not against Pakistan per se. So there you have another player in the game, and Pakistan and China are allied, not allied in a formal sense as we are with our NATO alliance, but they have a long-range partnership with a lot of economic and high-tech assistance flowing between Beijing and Islamabad. So that's what worries me about the situation in Asia, that it is an especially complex mutual deterrence relationship there, and I think could be, I stress could be, more unstable with a major deployment of nuclear capabilities across those three countries could be more unstable than, the more or less stable assured destruction relationship that we existed in for many years under the Cold War. But in the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis again brought us up sharp against the shocking notion that we could really bring about nuclear conflagration. So bear that in mind. I think it's a more complicated situation in Asia than we looked at historically. Thanks. Please.
I'm Kyle. I'm studying political science. And again, about Southeast Asia, you said there's a multiplayer game there, and you mentioned that both India and Pakistan broke the moratorium on testing in the late 90s. And you again mentioned that this treaty was meant to be a speed bump in them developing more advanced capabilities.
Right.
So if India is worried about China, and China, since they've had it so much longer, I imagine that they will have more advanced systems. What advantage do both Pakistan and India, what's motivation do they have to agree to this treaty if it will officialize their inferior status with nuclear weapons?
I think it's better to think about it as giving them, again, it's that predictability point I made earlier. They are already living under a moratorium, and so they have agreed not to test. They are not testing. We are constantly pressing them very hard, actually, not to even think about nuclear testing. And so far, they have seen that. Again, it's this more or less ephemeral. It's hard to describe it. It's not something concrete, but their position on the world stage, their reputations on the world stage, they understand, have to do with continuing to maintain certain aspects. Although they're not members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty per se, both of them have said that we want to advance non-proliferation goals around the world. We want to advance the non-proliferation regime, small n, not NPT, large N, but the non-proliferation regime around the world. So a lot of their kind of position in the world is based on their being responsible players in the non-proliferation arena. So frankly, I think they would welcome, in the end, assuming that the United States and China sign up and that the treaty is brought into force, I think that they would see it as being a benefit to be able to understand that in the future others would not be able to get out ahead. Their counterpart, the Pakistanis looking at India, the Indians looking at Pakistan, that there would not be an opportunity for some rush to superiority. So I do think that, again, you have to think about it in that large context of this moratorium that is already in place being cemented down forever with a legally binding verification regime associated with it. So they would, I think, gain from it a great deal of predictability about their own strategic future that would make a big difference to them.
We're out of time, but we can probably try to speed through the last two questions.
Yeah, please, why don't we do two at once? Hello, good to see you.
My question is, since treaties generally deal with states and diplomacy deals with states, and there's no immediate threat to my knowledge of a non-state entity such as a terrorist organization gaining access to nuclear capabilities, how does the United States view the possibility of a terrorist organization or a non-state organization gaining access to nuclear capabilities, and what sort of preventative measures do we keep?
Okay, that's a very good question. Would you mind just introducing yourself quickly?
Of course. My name is Emily Burton, and I'm studying political science.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Emily. Why don't we take your question as well, and I'll answer them both at once.
My name is Marcel, and I am studying international relations. And my question has two dimensions. The first one is I understand that the Obama administration is pushing towards, nuclear deterrence. And what future do you see? Is it possible that the U.S. can get rid of all its nuclear program, even if other nuclear countries aren't able to get rid of theirs? And if they do, what would be the future of the U.S. as one of the greatest power in the world? And the second dimension is when we talk about negotiations, both parties have to bring something to the table. And with the U.S. negotiating with Iran nuclear program, what is the U.S. bringing to the table? to this peace process.
Okay, very good. Your first part of your question and your question about nuclear terrorism actually fit very well together. And I did not talk about President Obama's Prague speech very much, but in 2009, he made a speech talking about seeking a world free of nuclear weapons in a very responsible and step-by-step way. But the reason he talked about proceeding toward a world without nuclear weapons and de-emphasizing nuclear weapons in our own national policy is precisely because of the terrorist threat. Because terrorists, we already talked about mutual assured destruction, we talked about those deterrence relationships, we believe that they are not deterrable. So if they get their hands on fissile material that can be put into weapon systems, if they get their hands on a nuclear warhead, they will try to use it, and in the most brutal way, as we've seen in ISIL's behavior in the Middle East in the last couple of months. So the impetus for the President's Prague Initiative and our effort to reduce and eliminate nuclear warheads and fissile material all over the world is precisely the impetus that we have to tackle the threat of terrorists getting their hands on nuclear weapons. And this is the best way, we believe, and the President believes, to go about it. But it gets to the question about whether the United States can still stand tall if it doesn't have nuclear weapons. That is at the heart of the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, that the nuclear weapon states will proceed step by step also to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons through Article 6 of the NPT. The basic view there was that, yes, in the end, it will be actually stabilizing for the entire world community if nuclear weapons are dealt with and if we are able to rid the world of nuclear weapons. So there's that basic argument that's out there from the days the NPT was negotiated, tied once again back to the horrible situation of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the threat of nuclear conflagration, but now made worse by the threat of terrorists getting their hands on nuclear weapons. And final point, we're not alone at the negotiating table with the Iranians. It's actually a group of 6 countries, US, UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China, along with the EU, negotiating with the Iranians. And what we bring to the table for the Iranians is sanctions relief. Their behavior in building up their nuclear capability has been such that the entire world community is afraid they're embarked on an illicit nuclear weapons program. So if they agree now to rid themselves of their enrichment capacity, for example, bring it down to a judicious level, then they get relief from the very strong economic sanctions that have been placed on them and have been crippling the Iranian economy over the last couple of years. That's what brought them to the negotiating table in the first instance, that the fact that there were very strong economic sanctions affecting the health of their economy. So thank you all very much. These were terrific questions. I wish we had a little bit more time, but thank you all for coming today, and it was really, really great to be here. Thank you.